Hi, students. I just wanted to take a moment to review some of the remaining slides that were a part of our last discussion of contemporary family patterns. We left off talking about divorce and divorce rates, but we were also talking about cohabitation. We talked about changes in timing of marriage or the postponement of marriage. We looked at a number of different explanations for why that might be. So, as we go through these remaining slides, I'd also like for you to think about the question of why are these changes occurring? What are some of the economic, cultural, social, political reasons that we might be observing the changes that we see? So, one of the first ones that I'd like to talk about is single parent families. One of the patterns that we talked about when we looked at our pie chart is how the composition of families is changing. And even though about half of families are still made up of married couples with or without children, a growing percentage of American households are made up of single parent families. Currently, about 26% of children live in single parent families, which is up from 11% in 1970. It's probably next to single people who are living by themselves and not getting married at all. One of the fastest growing household types, and it's definitely the fastest growing family type. So it represents a move away from tradition. Approximately 13.7 million single parents live in the United States, and they're raising about 21 million children. So, again, approximately 26% of minor children are being raised in single parent families. Again, a really important topic that we'll be talking about later because there's some important issues that we'll be dealing with. What does this mean about how we approach or think about family and what families look like? How does this impact children? How does it impact dynamics of parenting? Are there economic issues or concerns that we should be addressing now that we know that single parent families are not just some kind of family types, few and far between, but actually represent a very significant portion of families in the United States? Are we prepared to economically support those families? This graphic that we're looking at right here shows, again, a graphic representation of family structure and how families have changed. It's representing the percentage of U.S. children who are living in different family types. So if we look at the goldenrod on the top, we're looking at the percentage of children who are living in a house with two married parents who were in their first marriage, a very traditional notion of family. Well, in 1960, that was about 73% of children. In 2013, that's about 46% of children. And if we go to the bottom and look at the green color, we'll see the green shade in the middle refers to single parent families. So that's telling us about 9% of U.S. children were living in single parent families in 1960, and that is up to 34% in 2013. If we look at the total percentage of U.S. children. So again, an important changing contemporary pattern or trend that we'll be focusing on. But we're also going to talk a little bit more about an aspect of single parent families that I don't think gets addressed as much, and that's the growth in the number of single parents that are men, single parent households that are led by fathers. The percentage of single fathers has actually increased over the last 50 years significantly. 16% of men are custodial parents now, which is up from 3% in 1960. Again, this will be an important issue later when we talk about gender in families. But it's also an important question for us to consider now when we start asking the question of why. Why do we think we're seeing more single fathers now than, in 1960? Or Why are more fathers getting awarded custody now than in 1960? What does this say about changing gender roles? What does this say about changes in how the state or court views family, views parenting, views who's fit to be a parent? So it'll lead to some interesting conversations later on when we talk about gender dynamics and how this impacts the family as well. I also want to point out another interesting change. Um, what sociologists generally refer to as changes in family size, or that families are getting smaller. And really, what we mean by families are getting smaller is that people are having fewer children, that families today are smaller. There are fewer children. People are typically starting their families a little later, and they're having fewer kids, more closely spaced together. Versus, as we'll talk about when we look at how families have changed over the last 100 to 200 years, oftentimes women spent a very long period of their adulthood um, pregnant or having children. And now women are doing that in a much smaller span of time. This goes back to the postponement of marriage, too. If you're waiting longer to marry, then typically it means that you're probably not going to have as many children because that window for childbearing for many women. Um, can start to get shorter and shorter the longer that you wait. We also know that this pattern in family sizes being smaller, fewer births, is something that we've been seeing across racial lines. African Americans, Latinos, and white families have all been experiencing this exact same trend. The statistics that you're looking at here refer to African American families. In 2008, about 12% of African American families contained three or more children. That's down from 18% in 1980. If we look at Latino families, 18% of Hispanic families contain three or more children in 2008. That's down from 23% in 1980. And when we look at Caucasian families with three or more children, that declined to 9%. That's down from 11% in 1980. So again, we have to ask ourselves the question of why. When we look at the history, which is our next class, looking at how families have changed over the last 100 to 200 years, you'll get a very good historical explanation of why that's occurred. But even if we look at that pattern occurring still to this day, there are different reasons for why we're observing smaller families. And of course, we'll look at everything from how uh, timing of marriage plays into that, but also how changing gender roles plays into it as well, how economic factors play in also. Another important pattern or trend to focus on is dual earner families. A dual earner family refers to any family where both partners, spouses, parents work. So if mom and dad both work, you're a dual earner family. Um, and it's one of the key trends that we've observed in families changing over the last 60 years is the growing number of women who are entering into the paid labor force. We know that traditionally the idea has always been that men, provide and women stayed home. That wasn't the case in all families at any point in American history, but it definitely was considered to be the norm or the tradition of families 60 50, 60 years ago. Uh, Currently, 40% of married couples with children have both spouses working full time outside of the home. And this represents a significant increase over the last 60 years. If we look at the graphic that's on your screen right now, you'll see that this shows reference to the percentage of working women who have minor children at home. So this means that women have children in the home, but they're also working. By minor children, it just means that the child is not over the age of 18. In 1950, that was only 22% of women who were working while still having children in the home. But in 2010, that's about three quarters, 74% of women who work have children at home. If we look at the statistic below that, you'll see something even more significant. 65% of mothers with children under 6 years old were employed either full or part time. So, what that's telling us is that women who are working are not only women that have children that are older and self sufficient, but women with minor children, babies, children under the age of 6, are also um, providing for their families outside of the home, but also having to take on all of their child care roles. Now, one of the reasons that I think this is one of the most interesting patterns for us to focus on later on is because of everything that it tells us about changes in our society. It tells us about how changes around gender and gender roles are impacting the family. It also tells us about how our economic changes impacting the family, that more and more women are going to work because of necessity and because of the growing number of men who are unable to find work. It tells us something about, how dynamics inside of families are changing as people are now trying to combine all of the responsibilities of work and all of the responsibilities of home. How does this change the dynamic of families? Is there more conflict? Are people struggling to balance work obligations with family obligations? So, again, these are all things that we will talk about much later on in the class, but this represents a very significant pattern as well. One additional pattern that I'd like to talk about is the multi-generational family. Multi-generational families refer to households that are comprised of more than one, uh, I should probably say multiple generations. It might be parents and their birth children, but those parents might also have their parents living with them. There may be sisters and brothers, nieces and nephews all living in the home together. The growth of the multi generational household, particularly, was accelerated during the economic downturn, or what we call the Great Recession, which happened around 2007, 2008, and went on probably for the next 6 or 7 years after that. Um, in 2008, 6.2 million intergenerational households resided in the United States, about 5.3% of all households. But that number jumped to 7.1 million households by 2010, so just over a 2 year period, representing 6.1% of all households. The increase in these 2 years represented the fastest rate of growth in multi generational households than the previous 8 years combined. So, what that's telling us is that people were using the multi generational household or the multi generational family as a strategy, an economic strategy during very difficult times. So, again, this goes back to the issue of thinking about how does the economy impact families in times of difficulty in relation to the economy. How do families cope? How do households manage? And this was one of the strategies that was used. Instead of having, for example, two independent households, people consolidated households. Parents moved in with their children. Children who had left the nest, maybe went on to college, decided to come home after college and stay with their parents for a few additional years. So, again, this became a strategy. So, I just wanted to address those final slides as we, excuse me, y'all. As we move on to our next topic, I mentioned that we're still going to be talking about patterns and changes over time. But now we're going to be doing it within the context of talking about family history. We're going to be looking at, excuse me, I have assigned an article for you that's on Canvas that basically is about family history over the time period of about 1600 until about 1800. Very fascinating read. So I ask that you look it over and answer the questions, and this will be the topic of our discussion on Tuesday. Thank you.